Okay, recording is on. So hi everyone, welcome to the catalog sync at the new time. Um, and I think we have, I actually forgot where we were last sync. I think we went through quite a few topics and um, we didn't have much progress, I believe, in in the PRs merging or things like that. There are some PRs going on, but there were no PRs merged yet. So I think if we don't have any other topics, we can just jump into the discussion points uh, that are listed in the doc.
Can I make a suggestion? I know that we have quite a large topic as number two, and then the smaller topic is number one. I think it's important to get to the smaller topic, but we might want to time box that so that we don't spend the whole hour talking about delimiters.
Yes, that's for sure. Okay, so for the namespace separator, I think there are some disagreements on the tab list. Do we want to talk about that?
Sure. I can go first. I'll lay out sort of the problem that we're trying to solve here, and the potential solutions. So the issue is that we decided to, in the API, use a delimiter character for multi-part namespaces. So this is a namespace with, logical parts instead of a single identifier. We used a delimiter character that in newer versions of the Servlet API is disallowed because it's a non-printable character, even though it is the ASCII separator character. And so certain things are now failing. So we've got a route that's behind a proxy that is now failing. And also, if you update the tests to use a newer Servlet API, those tests also start failing in the main project. So we need to figure out a way to change or update the separator character. What I think is the easiest, most direct route is to make this configurable. So introduce a property that the service can send to a client and say, hey, please use this separator character. The client would then be able to, and this would be a configuration property in the reference implementation on the client side. So the client could, just configure this for a service, so it doesn't have to come through the config route. The client would then use either the separator character or that character, depending on, if it's an older client that doesn't know about this setting, then it would use the existing separator character. And the service would have to use either the 1F character or the configured character to split. I think that's a pretty clean thing, and it fits with our existing sort of ethos to delegate to the server implementation for things like policy on what characters names can contain and things like that. Now, there are alternatives to this. So I guess the main alternative that's been suggested is that we introduce the ability to escape characters. So this would mean that we have a defined character like dot for the separator character. Then we introduce a way to escape the separator character if it's used in a name. And then we introduce a way to escape the escape character if that's used in a name. Pretty standard string escaping rules. I think the trouble with that is that it is a lot more complicated of a scheme. And what we wanted was to make this pretty easy, because we want individual users to be able to alter and look at URIs or URLs, and that's quite a bit more difficult. So yeah, I'll hand it off to Robert to, I guess,
Yeah.
for the delimiter and escaping.
Yeah. So the issue I see is Iceberg doesn't have any restrictions on which characters are allowed on any namespace element or table name. I mean, in principle. So whatever character is chosen has a latent risk of being used in a namespace element. Further, also a slash parameter is allowed in namespace elements. And the slash parameter, even in its encoded form, is not allowed in a servlet spec. So whatever is being done will break either users or break the specification, the new specification. So the only clean way I see is to have new endpoints. Everything else has a latent risk to break existing installations. Go ahead, then.
So I think that there's probably a little bit of a misconception about what we're trying to do with being very non-restrictive with strings and representations within the Iceberg spec. And it's not to try and enforce that like everything has to be as flexible as the spec is. It's that we want to accommodate different systems and we don't want to be too prescriptive. And in that sense, like we delegate to the server to kind of define what's allowed. And this, like the approach of adding a delimiter that the server sends back is in line with that. Like the server kind of tells you what its limitations are. And it's going to reject characters that are not allowed. Like if you try and create a namespace with, characters and the backend implementation is a Hive metastore or a Teradata or something like that, they're going to have certain restrictions that they impose. And we want to allow them to impose those restrictions. But by allowing the server to also define what is a separator character, it means that that implementation within the context of the client and the server then is going to be fine. It's going to be consistent. So we don't have to necessarily go through the effort of defining a whole like escaping mechanism.
But which character would you choose if every character is allowed?
So every character is not allowed. The service can define the characters that are allowed. In Tabular, for instance, we had many characters that were not allowed because we actually had standards and rules for what characters were allowed in certain identifiers.
And this is like if you look across
the character in the range,
if you look across systems in this space, Iceberg is already a superset of what is allowed in Hive, Glue, BigQuery, things like that. So I don't feel it's necessary for us to solve the problem of like arbitrary anything goes.
I still think it has a latent risk of breaking existing users.
So can you explain that? Because you say that it will break existing users, but what is the case where there's something
we don't know? I mean, for example, in Nessie, we allow every character, basically, right? Everything that's roughly
so you could continue using 1F as your separator character. So introducing an option to change the separator character.
But it's
doesn't break anyone,
it's a control character, right?
Because it's an option that a service can choose to use. Nessie can choose to use the existing separator character.
But I think we are going to tackle the servlet spec v6 problem, where control characters are not allowed.
Okay.
And even that, I mean, people aren't prohibited from putting a slash into a namespace element, and the slash, even in its encoded form, is definitely rejected. And that's also a fact that the current proposal doesn't tackle.
So you're saying that you want to change Nessie because this is going to cause a
We can't-
break, but
No, we can't
but
change
you're
users'
also-
installations.
you're worried that Nessie, if you don't change it, would break?
I'm not concerned about Nessie as a software. I'm concerned about data, users' data. We can't just change users' namespace elements. That's definitely a no-go.
Sorry, I'll let Yufei or Jack go next.
Yeah, I can go next. Yeah, personally, I don't. I think the server-side configuration for separator is fine, and I feel like so what Robert said is we don't actually have any restriction on the character, which potentially if this particular client can send anything which is kind of breaks the protocol between the server and the client. The another point I put in this rally is why do we need this kind of a flexibility? Because I think from what I'm reading from the thread, the only benefited from that flexibility is to reconstruct the multi-part namespace. What's the use case for that? For me, if we flatten to the same set of the namespace, it's fine. Because we eventually we treat them exact same. If A dot B dot C then becomes ABC, that's completely fine. Right? This is the same level of the semantic we want to reach. By introduce separator means the only flexibility we got is we can reconstruct back to either A dot B dot C or A dot B and another is C. But I don't quite understand why do we needed to care about that use case. Why don't we just force that we just use the dot as the separator?
So I would be totally fine with using the dot as the separator. That was our original argument, is like you almost never run into situations. In fact, we've been doing this for columns for 6 years now, and almost 7 years actually. And the only times people have ever noticed this behavior is when they're writing kind of silly test cases that use like A.B and A.B.C and things like that. Sorry, Jack.
I think one benefit to use dot is first dot by using dot we don't need to escape or encoding that in the URL string, right? It's already valid character in the URL. We don't have to do anything. And it is already like everybody is kind of agree on, the whole industry agree on this character is for the separate of different namespace plus table names. And we don't have to implement multiple kind of a logic to let client side to decide, okay, this time I have to use this character for the separator.
So I'm actually on the camp of supporting configurable separators because when we evaluate potentially mapping glue data catalog to IRC endpoint, this is actually one of the issues we identified that because today in Glue is one of the catalogs that allow you to define whatever name you want, apart from, I think, spaces. You cannot do spaces, but any other character you can do in the database names. And that makes this essentially break. Like, I think the example in the chat, like with the slash, is actually even more troublesome in when we trying to map it to IRC. So there is a similar feature actually in Glue when we use it with Hive Metastore, which is we allow the customer, the client side, to define the separator, because typically that is sufficient since the users are like, if an organization says that actually all my databases have all my namespaces have dots in that, then they can choose another character. So there we haven't seen anyone who has all sorts of crazy characters in their namespaces yet, and they usually are able to just choose one of the other characters to be able to separate the value. So I think if we want flexibility in accommodating all sorts of different names, then maybe a client-side separator value, which I think was also one of the options proposed in the dev list, could be the way to go here.
If you're done, Jack, I would like to kind of reset the discussion maybe a little bit. I don't think the problem is limited to separators. In the sense of namespace separators, I think the new servlet specification defines a certain class of symbols that are considered suspicious. For example, slash, backslash, hash mark. How do we envision dealing with those symbols? Like even in a single level namespace, like if you look at my example in chat, would anybody be up to answer that?
So I can add some context to it. We actually right now have tests in the catalog, tests that are being executed by different catalog implementations. And we already have options in there where you can say, hey, I'm a catalog that supports slashes in namespaces. Or I think in namespaces. And there are other catalogs where you can say, I'm not supporting that. Right, so it's up to catalog implementations, and right now the REST catalog supports it, but when you switch to the latest Jetty version, which is 12 something, you're running into this restriction where you cannot support this anymore, right? But what I'm trying to say is, like, it's up to the catalog to decide whether this is something that is supported or not.
Why do you have
catalog
to jump
sorry, Robert, go ahead.
No, go ahead, you were first.
Okay, sorry. Catalog in the sense of REST API implementation, right? But suppose, the REST API implementation itself, if we want to support the new serverless specification, we have to define how we deal with those special characters. They're not special. The term I think they use is suspicious. And many servlet containers will just deny them, I think.
Yeah, my guess is that most catalogs are just going to say these characters, don't have enough value for us to worry about this.
Yeah, they may not have value in the sense of URI paths, but they have value in namespaces, maybe. Slash is just one of the examples. I think there are other characters that will be denied.
So yeah, maybe what we should do is allow the service to send a deny list for characters, and we just sanitize on the client side. I think, wouldn't that solve the problem?
No, because if you have a namespace element that has such a special character, your service is completely broken.
Only if you allowed the
but if you have existing data, an existing namespace element with a slash in it will break. There's no way around it.
Well, so
we're getting pretty far away from the real problem, though. At that point,
it's the same problem.
This is the servlet problem, yeah.
No, if you have a namespace element with a slash in it, you can't access this with Jetty 12. Period. No way around. Except Jetty allows you to disable this check.
What about path element encoding? Are we not doing that for these supplied elements?
Yeah, the problem with the new serverless specification is that they explicitly say, even if you encode slash using the percent notation, we think you're doing something wrong, and we're going to deny you.
That's pretty restrictive. Okay.
I mean, yeah, in all honesty, I was surprised that they actually put this in the spec, but that's the wording. I mean, not the exact wording, but that's the intent. Yeah.
I assume that's because there's probably implementations that like decode them at the wrong level and it causes problems. Suspicious.
So I
Admittedly,
understand the
specification
argument
was
here that's being made, which is, well, there are other characters that, you know, are no longer allowed in some of these cases. But you know, that's when that's used to say, hey, we should not do this other thing. I don't really understand what the alternative is that you guys are suggesting. Is it to introduce, you know, essentially a whole bunch of V2 routes for everything and have a way to encode slash that gets around the servlet implementation? Because I think far more people are going to basically just say, okay, don't put slash in your namespace names.
users do weird things.
No, but my question is, what is the alternative that you guys are suggesting?
So you can put a slash in there, and we do that in NESI and URI path for reference names, where we explicitly allow slashes, and that works fine.
Okay, so
As
yeah,
soon as you have a proper regex. But that doesn't solve all the other problems, given that every character is allowed, and the catalog can't automatically choose which is the right separator.
so
Because to do that, the catalog would have to look up everything, and doing that for, I don't know, 50,000 tables
that we
is not going to
do
work.
introduce V2 routes. How are you guys proposing we encode namespaces with slashes or multi-part namespaces or things like that? Because that's what's unclear. You're saying that, oh, there are certain things that won't work, but I'm not clear on what the proposed alternative is.
Yeah, I don't think anybody made any specific suggestions yet, but one option to consider is that putting this data into the payload, because payload is generally pretty lenient. We can use anything that is valid in JSON, and JSON certainly supports escaping and that kind of stuff, right? Rather than putting it in the path.
Yeah, that's one option. The other option is to have a well-defined escaping mechanism. The problem at the moment is
Tell us what that well-defined escaping mechanism is. Because it seems to me that you're no longer using URL escaping. You're basically creating custom escaping for these characters that works around the fact that they're suspicious characters.
no, yeah, it's basically a level above URL escaping, where you escape these special characters that would cause problems.
So I think we probably need to separate this into two separate problems, because we have the current problem, which is anybody who upgrades their servlet API is going to break with the current separator character, right? That's what we're running into right now. Other characters that are not accepted, that's already a problem. Like we've got a series of characters that probably won't work. If you put a slash into the pathing currently, if we're not URL encoding it, you're probably actually already broken. So I would almost say, like, let's change the how do we handle all character as a separate thing, which may require new endpoints. The difficulty there is like that touches every single endpoint that involves a namespace in it. It's a huge change, as opposed to fixing the most pressing issue, which is the current separator character will break, you know, tests and things like that. So I think there's a much bigger question. It may not even be solvable without like a complete, you know, mechanism to encode that path parameter that is fully acceptable by the new specification. I don't even know what that is, like base 64 encoding, like whatever it is. There may be an approach, but I think that there are actually two separate problems there.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Let's, why don't we, you know, consider a way to make the V1 paths work, which we seem to have consensus on. and separately go try to solve this problem for Nessie of Nessie wants to allow every single printable character in a namespace name, right? Like I think that we can see those two things as pretty separate problems, and that will unblock people using the V1 API, because I think we all agree that that works with some restrictions on what the service can support. And then we can, revisit the more general case for Nessie in the future.
I don't think the problem is specific to Nessie, though. The problem is with the Iceberg REST API specification, which does not right now define how to represent those characters that the new server specification considers suspicious. So anybody who implements the REST API on the new servlet engine will face this problem.
Right. That's true. And maybe the answer is base60 and 4 encode or something like that, where we're basically eliminating it as a human readable thing, because you can't have both like human readable and adhere entirely to the new specification. So because there are human readable things that they're disallowing, right? So maybe that's a configurable option that we send back. Here's the delimiter, whether or not you need a base64 encode the actual path elements.
Okay, I guess just a time check here. I think we spent some time on this topic, and it seems like Daniel suggested a few options to go. And do we want to move to the next topic?
I think that sounds great. I would say that this, though, is specific to Nessie, because other catalogs already restrict the characters that are allowed in these names. So while the specification essentially tries to allow whatever characters work, it's not a problem with the specification if some characters are not allowed. The specification just doesn't say that they are or are not allowed. So I think we should be clear about that. Just because the specification doesn't touch on these characters are disallowed doesn't mean that it's a breaking thing for servlets to not support them. What is breaking is a character that is required by the spec is not allowed. Okay, sorry, Jack.
One last word, please. I'm not sure why the push to that servlet spec version is that pressing at the moment. So I would be very careful with such changes in general. You don't know what you break.
Okay, cool. I think we have quite a few information, and also for Robert's point, I think we might also want to explain a bit more on the servlet upgrade side. We can have all those discussions on the dev list. So I guess the next topic is the updates for the server-side capability. So Edward, do you want to provide an update?
Yeah, so there have been a few discussions around, in what direction the current version of the server-side capabilities is going. And it seems like it caused some confusion about the core problem that we're trying to solve. And I'll probably go ahead and rephrase the problem, narrow it down to what we're trying to solve. Namely, we want to know on the client side what endpoints a server implements and supports, so that we can make decisions on the client side. So I'll rephrase the problem. I'll probably write up a new design doc, and we'll go from there. Because we essentially want to fix a narrow problem, and we just want to also frame the design doc and everything tied to that problem that we're trying to solve.
Okay, sounds good. That's actually much shorter than I expected. I thought we are going to discuss this. Are there any comments?
Raheel?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up a point on granularity, and I don't want to throw anyone off track. So in capabilities, eventually when we start to land newer APIs such as pre-plan and plan, it was never clear to me like how granular this would be. So for example, let's just say I have a service that has this capabilities for planning. Does that mean all the tables under this REST catalog supports planning? So I always thought that, and this is a conversation that me, Jack, and I think James Petty from AWS are having, is if this granularity should actually be reflected inside load table or planning. So essentially, let's say that you do a load table, then your service is going to return back to say, for this given table, my service supports planning, does not support it, or you get a default mode. So essentially, default in this case means that it's up to the client to choose if they would like to plan for this table. And then there would be some client-side configuration that basically allows the client to specify the preference if they want to go with client-side planning or remote-side planning. Okay, Ryan?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And I think part of the reason why we want to scope the problem down and be very clear about the scope. So the server-side capabilities or endpoints, that is what endpoints does the server expose and know about, right? It doesn't necessarily cover when you should call those endpoints. So, the problem of does a particular table support planning or pre-planning, should a client choose to use the server-side planning, those sorts of concerns, I don't think are part of this problem. This is just, does this service support planning at all? So that we can do things like, well, hey, this service doesn't support view, load view or view exists. So we know not to call them, and we know that views don't exist, right? We can replace that view exists check with a views don't exist because this service does not support views. On the plan and pre-plan stuff, we can say, oh, okay, so this service supports planning, and then get down to a table level, like, well, should I use planning? Is it up to the client? Is it up to the service? Is the service expressing a preference that the client does use server-side planning, right? And we know there are cases in which you would want to do that for things like restricting access to historical snapshots, right? So I think that we want to continue to see those two things as separate questions, because the fact that it is there doesn't necessarily mean that you should or should not call it. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, the +1 for restraining the scope. I think I was also expanded the scope quite a bit on the dev list for different topics related to versioning and things like that. And I think if we just focus the discussion here that Edward is doing to just the exposing the endpoints ability, and that should be a pretty straightforward conversation to have, and we should be able to proceed with the decision pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, and I think sorry, Yufei, you go.
Yeah, I think I have the same granularity concern with for the capability, because right now we have just a view, and of course with certain version attached to that view capability from that proposal, right? I feel like because eventually we're gonna add more and more, and things could change for certain endpoints. There's some open there's some way of people already doing is just to provide a bunch of the endpoints server supported. I think Mike from Google already pointed out that approach. I'm not sure if the new proposal, I haven't seen the new proposal, if we're gonna solve the granularity issue with that one. Because for me, the load will be also quite minimal. It's just probably less than 20 endpoints in that case, right? If we want to do the abstraction on top of these 20 endpoints, then it eventually will some new endpoint for the view or a new point for the table will just break that granularity and bite us again, and we have to fix that again. That's my point.
I think I agree with that. Where we have a set of endpoints where I'm defining endpoint as a path specification and a verb, right? HTTP method. I do think that we get into some trouble if we add logical groupings to that. I don't think it is enough trouble that we really care one way or another, but this is something that Micah has brought up. I think Walla just brought it up yesterday, and I think there are good arguments for just saying the service should tell you what endpoints it supports. That way there's no confusion. And we did hit this with plan and pre-plan, because the service may not support the pre-plan API. And we were thinking, okay, should a planning capability for server-side planning be split into plan and pre-plan, or should it just be one capability for both? And that problem of indecision is pretty much solved by just having, here's the set of endpoints I support. Like, service doesn't support pre-plan, then always call plan first. Things like that. We also, if we do introduce a different way of handling namespaces, because it's really important to be able to support the full range of characters in namespaces, printable characters in namespaces, then we would also have a somewhat interesting challenge of how do we change all of the namespace routes, and what does that do for capabilities? Whereas in the list, you just say, hey, I support all these V2 namespaces. So I think it is cleaner for maintenance in the long run. Again, like I don't think that I don't think that either one is really a big deal, right? Like, I could go either way personally. Like, I think the main thing is just focusing ourselves on this problem of what endpoints are supported by this service, so that we can cleanly introduce new endpoints and we're not blocking the server-side planning, and solving some challenges around decisions that need to be made on the client side. It is kind of I'll also acknowledge Dan's point, which is it's kind of a pain to check, does this service support every single endpoint? I think that we have a clean way of doing it with like resource paths, but yeah, that's kind of difficult.
I think the main thing is, like, I think it's powerful. It's flexible enough to allow clients to do smart things if they want to do smart things. I think it's also very likely a lot of clients won't implement that, and they will just call whatever endpoint they want. And if it doesn't work, they just say, well, the server's broken. So I think it's a good path forward without adding a ton of complexity, and gives a lot more flexibility than just the coarse grain groupings. So I'm willing to go along with it. I think it'll work.
So I think in summary, that's what Edward's new doc is going to propose. It's going to focus the problem on what are we trying to solve? That is, how do we know what endpoints a service supports? And then from there, propose the endpoint listing, how that would work, which is basically in the config, just send back a list, or sorry, not in the config, but alongside the config. From the config route, send back a list of supported endpoints.
Yeah, but so once I have the design doc, I'll share it on the mailing list, and we can start a discussion on that topic.
And Rahil, is it clear how we're answering sort of the question that you asked?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I will acknowledge, Rahil, that that's actually not an answer to the question that you asked. Like you're asking something that's very specific to how do we want to deal with and implement the pre-plan behaviors, and that's kind of a separate topic than how do we expose plan and pre-plan. And for the specific question of like, hey, is pre-plan supported for a service, or do they only support planning? Like this answers that question, but the other ones we'll have to deal with as a separate discussion.
Yeah, the table level.
Yeah.
I just want to add one more comments because I see Jack writes things about the flags, which also go through the config endpoint to the client side. I think that is even finer granularity than the endpoint. That's what I'm take on. I'm not sure Jack have another point on that flag. Because other than the true or false, Jack mentioned you can do the multiple states of the flag, right?
Yeah, I think that is something I also want to maybe separate as the next step discussion, because so far the flag, I think we have one example of the flag for metrics, and that is essentially for the purpose of discovering the metrics endpoint, right? And so that fits what we have been discussing so far. I guess after that is finalized, we could think about if there are cases where we might want to have multiple choices for the service to express. Actually, like maybe even for the namespace one, it is maybe a multiple choice that Catalog can say what separator I use for the namespace. And that is potentially a way we just formalize to say that we will first have the initial layer of service discovery, and then if there are finer grained things, we have that in the configs. Maybe that seems to be the trend to go here. But I was considering that as maybe the next step discussion.
I agree with the direction of like let's unblock like pre-plan some of the newer features that we want to roll out, fix the existing problem hopefully by 1.7 with views that we set out to solve originally, and then figure out some of these other finer points.
Cool. Any other comments before we move to the next topic? Okay, so the next one is the notification endpoint in Polaris. Actually, I put this up. I just want to discuss this with the group of people here, because I think for people who don't know Polaris, Snowflake Polaris is going through the Apache incubation proposal, and the project is also open sourced as one of the Iceberg REST catalog implementation. And in the project, there is a notification endpoint that is introduced, which is not in the official IRC APIs yet. So I'd like to know what is our thought around that API. Yeah, that's kind of the background.
Can you give us a quick overview of what the endpoint does? Is it just to request notifications? Is it to is it a pull? Is it to request a push? Is it like?
So for the implementation, oh, sorry.
But yeah, so you can go, or you know, I can also chime in. I know, unfortunately, I had missed. I was out of office in the last syncs discussion. You know, it's a little because I think there are elements that are related to the discussion that Maninder brought up a couple of weeks ago. Oh, I see right here. I think that's the other one. Okay. So I guess, you know, in a nutshell, you know, for now, this endpoint on the Polaris side is for receiving a notification, but it's the idea here isn't exactly the you know, general purpose notification yet. I think there's actually a couple concepts that I think got a little bit entangled, and it sounds like in the last sync, most of the discussion revolved around this slightly more abstract idea of you know, arbitrary events or notifications. The naming of this, you know, being, you know, talking about notifications might be the culprit for making the discussion primarily focus on that. But more functionally, I think there's a concept here that is that seems to be worth talking about, which is the idea of how to reflect tables into a catalog in a way where you can express that these aren't necessarily owned by this catalog, but you want them to be reflected out in a way so that they're readable, right? I know, you know, it's kind of related to I know there's another discussion about having a read-only notion. Like, for example, we had talked about how, I think it was in a discussion list about how Hadoop catalog is not good for mutations. But if there's a way to, but in some use cases, people want a way to have like a self-descriptive file that still represents a table, and that if there's a way for a catalog to express something as read-only through a file, then maybe that would still be somewhat palatable. So sorry, that might be a little bit off topic, but in this case, the functionality is about how to make it, in this case for Polaris, to be able to expose a table that it itself does not own, and to have updates for that, and to have an updated view of that table.
Can I ask a quick question? So this is like an endpoint where if I'm mirroring a table into a catalog that does not own that table, when an update to the table that I own happens, I call this endpoint on the remote catalog.
That's right, exactly.
So okay, got it. That makes sense to me.
Well, so I have a couple concerns about this, just looking at the API, because what this does is it introduces another way to update a table that exists in the catalog, but does not go through the commit path, right? So it looks like, you know, based on what's in the actual table update notification, is you have a table name, timestamp, UID, and a metadata location. And I assume that what we're doing is we're just pointing this to a new metadata location.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, it sounds like you know, what you're implying there is, yes, if you allowed other update, like if you still allowed update table on the same tables that would have been received here, that would be a big problem, right? Because we're essentially talking about like a different commit protocol that lives outside of the core spec. So there is something that maybe isn't expressed at that endpoint, but like I mean, in Polaris, the way it's expressed is that you have a concept of an external catalog. So, and you know, certainly this is something that is worth iterating on, right, and refining. But
let me clarify though, like it seems strange to me that we would put a separate endpoint outside of the commit table path that wouldn't go through something like a replace table operation that would have this functionality. Because what you're doing is you're actually doing a replace table.
Yeah.
What you're saying is, hey, I want to replace this table and I want to set the metadata location to this.
Yeah.
But instead of going through the commit table endpoint, we are going through some other backend endpoint to update the table. So all I'm saying is, like, what we're doing here seems like it can be represented as an actual operation against a table commit. So why aren't we just saying that, like, hey, this is an RTAS equivalent where we're also sending the metadata location of the replacement? Ryan?
So to me, I somewhat agree with that, but does that require that you diff the table?
No,
So, like, I mean, this is just saying this is basically an idempotent, like, here's the new state of the table. And I think that that is valuable, or that seems valuable. I guess I'm undecided somewhat there. It is always nice to have, it would be great if a notification was like, here's what happened to this table, right? I added this snapshot. I, ran these validations or something like that. But you don't necessarily have that. I guess it's a good point. We should think about whether we need that.
just conceptually, this feels like a replace table operation, right? We're saying replace table. The endpoint of like notification, other things like that, that doesn't really fit my model of how you would represent this. And I'm not arguing with like, hey, why would we want this or not want it? I'm just talking about the mechanism by which we're actually affecting this change. It seems strange that we're introducing a new commit path that is outside of the table commit path.
Yeah, if I can jump in, listening to the problem statement, I wonder if a sort of push-based notification model is even sort of the right approach for what you're looking for here. Like it seems like you could, excuse me, you could also have a sort of catalog forwarding mechanism that would allow Polaris to say, oh, I don't know where this schema is, but I know where some other catalogs are. I can ask if they have them, as opposed to needing to push notifications from one catalog to another. You could sort of hook catalogs up to each other so that they can ask for the most recent listing of tables and table notifications. But I don't want to derail the conversation too much, but yeah, I think to Dan's point, I'm not sure if a table swap is necessarily the right model for the problem.
Maybe to jump in there from my side, I'm the author of the Rust catalog that we currently have, and we have notifications implemented in a very different way. So for us, I don't think it is the right way to include this in the REST specification to receive this as like a notification endpoint. I think this would rather be part of a table update as of the commit endpoint here. But for me, like the more valuable standardization would be outside of the REST specification to have a standard way how catalogs actually publish events on any changes that happen. So the way we implemented this is basically we already have this great standard of all the different tables updates we have. So we are just pushing them out to NUTS or to Kafka or to any other event queue. And then any other system that would be interested in this change can react on it. Because it might not only be catalogs that are interested in what metadata changes happened to a catalog. You might have like a data contract validation system, or you might have any other project that wants to actually react if something has been done to your table. So I think having a push-based approach based on events would be much more valuable to achieve the same goal. And then any catalog can just decide to listen to whatever another catalog publishes or not.
Yeah, and actually, that's alluding to what we discussed 2 weeks ago, or what was in this meeting 2 weeks ago. I think that would be sort of the element of like the entire notification and events system, which I think is also worthwhile, but it's a large area, right? And I think aside from that, I think on the Polaris side, what we noticed is that it's usually useful to be able to just also have a mechanism on the other end. Like in some cases, if you don't want to build something that is doing the polling or pull based model, it's still useful to have a way to push into the catalog instead. Like in some scenarios, it could be that like you don't have you don't want to set up permissions in a way that a receiving catalog can pull, right? So like for example, if you just want the receiving catalog to sort of be a lightweight, a lightweight view of things, then you might want a way to push it. And I think to Dan and Ryan's point, there's an element here where I totally agree that maybe notifications isn't the right way to express this. Maybe it is a force update table or something like that. But I think there are a couple elements of the semantics that are worth putting it into maybe a different endpoint or at least a different surface area. In that the semantics of this, we want it to be clear that it's not exactly an update. Like it's not an update where this receiving catalog is in charge of deciding on the transactionality. It's sort of saying like, don't, like the external source will say like, don't worry, we got it under control over here, so just trust this update, right? Like just reflect this as the latest state, which is a different semantic than saying like, I'm trying to do this commit, right? So at the very least, it's like splitting a descriptive update versus a prescriptive update.
I think Yufei was next.
Yeah. Another point that kind of off topic. So we are talking about different mechanisms to update table and push and pull based ways. Another point I want to bring up is I think we try to have exchange protocol between the different catalogs, which could be standardized other than just random, because in that way, each different catalogs, when they sync with each other, they have to adapt to each other's format, which I think it's a lot of work for everybody. It's a burden for everybody. That's another point I see from this proposal. It's other than how do we update that table, how do we trust that update from the other catalog? Yeah, that's it.
So I actually really like Dan's point here, which is this is kind of just a table update that ends up stomping the table state. What if, and like I just throwing this out there as an idea, it would be more clean if we were to introduce a new table update in the protocol that says, set table state to this metadata file, right? So just add that. That's very clean. It doesn't require a new endpoint. It would be a, set metadata location and things like that. Then we could also use so point one to Christian's, use case, we would be able to take that and stick that in an event log, for example, right? Like, hey, if I receive this set table state to a particular endpoint, we could reuse that, and we could reuse the existing update endpoint and things like that, and then maybe make this informational or largely informational, right? Because if you were to accumulate a set of changes to table metadata and then just have a thing that says, oh, actually, no, set the table metadata to this, that gives us a way to express both what's happening in this commit in terms of the existing table updates, and then also what the actual like end state. So I kind of like that. I think that's pretty clean. It lends itself to sending these things downstream for events and things like that. I'm not sold on it yet, but I think that might be a good way to incorporate this sort of functionality.
Yeah, that makes there is one thought that comes to mind though, which is that there's also an additional semantic that we probably want to think about expressing there, which is to say that how you want to tag this table or tag it in a way where you'd say like this catalog only accepts these force updates on this particular table and not arbitrary commits. Because the problem would be that if another catalog is using this as a way to just sort of reflect a read or what it thinks is a read-only state. If you do accept commits, then you implicitly create a divergent branch, or rather a fork, so to speak, that they don't mutually know about, right? So it to be able to express that there is an owning and a non-owning catalog. Also, sorry, I missed the cue.
Maybe from my side, just one quick like concern or things that maybe could go wrong is, I mean, we have a lot of things that are different between catalogs, and this endpoint would basically require a catalog to blindly accept what it gets. So that we would have to define in a way like those catalogs would have to need to be like quite similar, probably the same implementation. Otherwise, we would maybe run into the point that we discussed earlier, that one catalog is not accepting a point in a namespace name, the other one is. Then you get this, eat it or die kind of request, and you don't know what to do with it, and metadata would be out of sync. So it would only work between very, very aligned catalog, which raises the question if actually the Iceberg spec is the right place for it. Yeah.
That's fair. We would need alignment between the names that are supported. I don't really know that. So I still think that, not to reopen the earlier discussion, but like in 4 nines of cases, that's probably not a big deal. I think that I was also going to respond to Dennis's point, which is that if we have a way of saying both set the metadata to this location and send the changes that went there, I think that would be a really good thing. Like to Dan's earlier point, like having those changes is really valuable, because you say that you are updating your state of the world. Yes, you want to know like what the current metadata location is, but you may also have things that trigger actions, right? So you don't necessarily want to, if you get a schema update, say, right, you don't necessarily want to have to go read the new file and figure out what changed and like update your state of the world. If you're just told, here's a new schema that was added to this table, then that can really be helpful. I think that would be a good feature to have. And you may also want in some cases to maintain separate metadata. So imagine you're doing like cross-region replication, right? I could have something that says, hey, this change added a snapshot and then set the current snapshot to this. And currently we could kick off a process that goes and copies all the data and rewrites the metadata files to keep those 2 tables in sync. So this could be used for that, and you don't necessarily have to read the metadata file. You can just say like, okay, I see that these things changed. Just yeah. But I think in general, I think we're probably supportive of this idea that we need to find a way to keep catalogs in sync with one another. Jack?
Yeah, I just think this is a good time to conclude the meeting, because we are 7 minutes over time, and I just brought this topic up because I think it was in Polaris, but it was never discussed in Iceberg yet. So I think this is a good time for us to start a discussion, maybe in dev list, and see what people think, and we can conclude a good path forward to support this feature.
Sounds like a good idea. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye.